thank you for everybody's patience as we work out the kinks here. We did have a scheduling hiccup here, so we'll be up and running here shortly. While we wait for Jordan here, quick introduction on myself. I'm Matt Smith. I'm the Vice President of Forest Operations for Finite Carbon. Finite's been a significant player in the world of forest offsets here for the last 10, 11 years, and I've been here since the beginning. And I am a forester, and I've been a forester for 37 years now, which makes me an old timer amongst this crowd. And we're really pleased to be able to talk to you a little bit today about something near and dear to my heart, and that's measuring trees. We getting there, Jordan?
I am getting there. I'm sorry. Give me one more second, and I will have this up and running here.
So the purpose of our short talk today, is that we were asked by our CEO Sean Carney to lift the veil a little bit on how trees are measured, and we kind of take it for granted as it's something that we do every day. But there's a whole lot of folks in this industry who really don't have a good appreciation for how different forestry is, and for how important tree measurements are in that whole process. So we're looking forward to sharing that with you today. If we can get our deck going.
I'm going to share this now, and it's not perfect here, but I will. And while you walk through this, I'm going to hopefully look for the other deck. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Bring up what you can.
Yeah. Here we go. Microsoft Office has decided now is a good time to update.
Of course they did.
Yes.
Of course they did.
This is actually a comedy routine for those of you in the audience. I'm sorry. I'm doing my best over here, fighting the gods of technology.
Well, I've got the gift of gab, so I'll keep talking.
Yeah, I mean, I think Matt, you probably know what the first 6 slides are anyway.
Yeah. So measuring trees, not something that's new to us. We've been measuring trees as a human race since biblical times. You can find references to cubits and using the distance between your elbow and the tips of your fingers to measure timbers and engineering and therefore trees. And so for as long as we have been transacting wood or growing and harvesting wood for specific purposes, we've been measuring trees to try to estimate if this tree's big enough to make this timber for a ship or not. And so this is a long-rooted history and part of who we are. Wood is an important part of our culture and our civilization. So we've been doing it for a long time. There we go, Jordan. Thank you. And that's for That's okay. We've been using it for transaction support to predict volumes to meet construction needs. But all of these things were understandably low tech, low accuracy. They were cheap, but there were no standards of measures. You can imagine my cubit isn't the same as Jordan's cubit, and so on and so forth. Go ahead, Jordan.
Okay.
So let's talk a little bit about what it means to measure a forest as an offset project then. There's a number of moving parts here. It's a very complicated science, and we're going to try to just do it at a very 101 level here today. But the first determination we must make is, how are we going to measure this forest? As an offset project, forests are very large, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even larger project of acres that we need to try to get out there, measure accurately, and report the carbon outcome for. And that represents a number of challenges. Quite honestly, forestry is one of the most time-consuming, intricate, and expensive parts of developing a working forest offset project. And so it needs to be very thoughtful. Forestry is also at a disadvantage amongst offset types in that we can't go to a forest and read a meter and know what the carbon outcomes are on a regular basis. It's simply not that tractable. It's not that predictable. And so we got to get creative and use other tools available to us, and statistical sampling is one of those. You can understand that if we had unlimited money, unlimited time, and a need for exacting inventory, we would measure every tree out there. But that's simply not a reality. So we have to use the theories of random sampling, and the bias-free selection of inventory locations at random across the property. And we use those random samples then to extrapolate timber measurements and tree measurements to offset project-wide or forest-wide carbon outcomes. So that's some of the intricacies of the design process of how we go about sampling something at this scale. It should be added that, go ahead, go back one more. It should be added that the process we go through here is not unique to carbon. This process is rooted in the estimation of board feet and for logs and cords of pulpwood or green tons that foresters have been doing for an awfully long time. The difference with carbon is that the intricacy and intensiveness of the measurements on private land especially are far greater. So we're performing at a much higher level for carbon than forestry has historically operated for other means. And that's important to understand. So the second part of this is, what are we measuring? You can see this young man in this photo measuring the diameter measurement location on a Douglas fir. And then the other photo is an example of some of our Alaska data collection work where you can see tree numbering. So we're actually recording each tree at those locations for their species, their diameter, their height. Sometimes that's a height to a 4-inch diameter. Sometimes it's total tree height. We're also collecting things like defect or soundness deductions, K-class for standing dead trees. We're trying to shift from a wood product focused inventory ideology to a biomass accounting ideology and gather all the metrics necessary to do that. Go ahead, Jordan. So where did all this come from? We made a big jump here from cubits to fairly intricate forest measurements, and had to happen in between to formalize this process and the procedures that took place. And the answer to that is really in the late 1800s here in the United States, when the USDA Forest Service and academics spent enormous amounts of time researching our forests and standardizing how we measure them. The standard practices, standard volume tables like those produced by Mr. Gerard here in this photo. This is all a genesis of the late 1800s, early 1900s that really developed the rule book that we follow. That rule book can be referenced, if you're interested in Googling it, through the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Handbook. And you can see the myriad of different requirements foresters have to account for when they're out there measuring trees. But this is very important in that it produced industry standards for how we measure things, and we follow those to a T today. What I want you to understand as well, though, is that up in the past and in the present, forest inventory is a manual labor and intensive process. We are physically sending foresters out to coordinates, running transects out there in the rain, the sleet, the snow, the snowshoes, the wildlife, the bugs, and all of these things. And that's important to understand as well, because that impacts how we do what we do and the accuracy of what we do. This is a very human situation. This is an analog situation in the past and becoming a digital and analog situation here currently. Go ahead, Jordan. So you can learn a lot about the past and the present in timber measurements, in forest measurements, by looking at the kinds of tools and practices that represent those periods. So I'm feeling really old, and I mentioned that I've been in forestry for 37 years, but I started my career on this page, on this slide. We were navigating to coordinates using analog compasses, sometimes staff compasses, sometimes hand compasses, and paper maps. Sometimes, if we were really lucky, we would have a black and white Xeroxed air photo from the Ag Center to go along with our paper topographic map. But these are the things that we were doing. And you can imagine the precision with which humans can operate on a complex landscape with tools like that. The answer is we did surprisingly well, but nowhere near as well as we are today. And I'll get into that here in a minute. Let's talk about how we measured tree diameters. Trees are a cone. They're wider at the base and narrow at the top. Some are more complicated than that, but that's a general feel for how they're considered in a volume calculation. But all trees have a different form to that cone, different taper. So one of the universal measurements that we start with in forestry is the diameter of the tree at breast height. So breast height is typically 4.5 feet above the root collar on the high side of the tree. But there are a myriad of other things that can happen with that tree at that location that can change where the appropriate diameter. But the standard approach, the standard location is at breast height. Well, historically, we've used things as simple as a graduated stick called a Biltmore Stick that is calibrated for a 25-inch reach. A forester would hold that stick out 25 inches from their eye against the tree and be able to read off the diameter of that tree at that location. So very simple, very analog, very salt of the earth type solutions to very real actions and problem solving out there collecting timber measurements. That stick is also graduated, and you can see the young forester holding out the stick vertically here in this picture under heights. It can use to calculate heights as well. If we know the distance back from the tree, we know the distance of the stick from the eye of the cruiser, the stick is held vertical, and we can read off the number of logs, 8-foot logs or 16-foot logs or 32-foot logs that are in that stem. So these are some of the very primitive tools that have been used historically. Some are still in use today. Other tools for diameter would include diameter tapes and calipers. A lot of calipers that an engineer might use. Well, we use as foresters very large calipers that we carry through the forest to measure trees in some instances as well. I've got a picture here of a diameter tape that is graduated to tenths of an inch. So those are also very popular and remain popular for diameters today. So I mentioned the Biltmore Stick used for heights. We also used analog tools, and I have a picture of an old altimeter here. We also used older tools like the reloscope, which is an analog tool. I've got a photo in the next slide. That is a very powerful tool even today to read off tree dimensions at distance. All of this data being collected in these ways was really in need of processing. We're going to collect all this data, usually on a paper tally card, and I have a picture of a tally book here that would be very typical. In fact, I have one next to my desk here today. All this paper tally would have to be collated back at the office and processed by hand. So I have a picture here of a volume table. So this would be a very typical table, sometimes per species of tree, that we would look up the diameter and the height of the tree, and it would tell us what the estimated board foot volume or cubic foot volume or cords that tree represents. You can imagine all this plot data coming into the office and foresters looking for rainy days to sit down at the desk and start crunching these numbers so that we can know the outcome. It's a laborious process. So when we look at the past, we still look at low tech by today's standards. Many of these tools somewhat still in use today, although it is a manual process here and very labor intensive, and with fair results for what its intended purposes were, but the precision and accuracy of these means are not comparable to what we're actually doing in carbon project development today. Next slide. Okay, so here we are today. And today is a digital world almost. Foresters are a notoriously conservative and orderly bunch, and we are slow to get rid of the tools we're most comfortable with, especially when we know they're doing a good job. So one thing I can say is that forestry seems to have completely embraced the use of GPS and GIS technology for our forest inventory planning, mapping, navigation, so on and so forth. And it has paid huge dividends. You can imagine that if I had to go 10 chains, which is 660 feet, to my next plot using a hand compass and maybe a tape, I would have to stay on that bearing no matter what the conditions were between me and that next plot. And that's an incredibly difficult way to go. If you talk about hiking and you think about hiking on a path versus bushwhacking it, that's the kind of difference I'm talking about. We used to have to bushwhack it and go through that brush or go through that difficult terrain, no matter what, to be able to stay on course and get to our next location. GPS has allowed us to take the path. We can go around and navigate to those coordinates from some other angle without staying on that bearing, and it's remarkably accurate, far more accurate than we could be consistently with other means. So navigation has really improved. Diameters, we're still wrapping tape around trees. I had one of those take your daughter to work moments here in a few years ago, where I took my teenage daughter to the woods, and I said, what do you think? We're cruising timber. And she says, well, Dad, you sure do hug a lot of trees, as I was wrapping tape around the tree to measure. And she's right. That's what we do. You have a forester here wrapping a tape at DBH, nice and level around a redwood. We also have new tools. Some trees have large buttresses or butt swells that we have to measure above. And short of carrying a step ladder with us, it can be really difficult to do that. Now, we have some analog tools that will do that, but we also have new tools like these laser calipers that allow us to project two parallel lasers and measure a diameter at any point on the tree. So really creative technological innovation here. When it comes to tree heights, which is one of the most important variables we collect, we're still using a combination of the old analog solutions like a clinometer, which is an analog tool, a level tool that's meant to calculate tree heights. We're using the reloscope, which is the gray colored instrument here at the bottom of the heights column that allows us to measure in any condition. But more often than not on a carbon project, we're using ultrasound type devices for distance, like the blue staff and the orange beacon here. We're also more consistently using laser hypsometers for heights, and this is a game changer as well. This allows a forester to collect accurate height data at nearly any distance from the tree. They can be more efficient and do multiple trees from one location. We used to have to measure back from every tree, which is a lot of walking. Don't need to do that anymore. It has just a rangefinder in it that allows us to do that. These are game changers. This is high precision equipment, and has had a meaningful impact on both our ability to collect the data, but also to check the data. Third-party verifications of plot data are integral to what we do, and so being able to measure them with a laser, get them really close, and then check them with a laser is really a big improvement. And lastly, processing of data. We're not crunching numbers manually anymore. We've got very powerful handheld computers. Some are related to forestry, like this Ranger. They're Windows-based machines where they can process data in real time for a cruiser in the woods if we choose. But all of this is automated into very high-tech models. So we have come light years from where we started in forestry, and all of these new technologies and the need, all these technologies are great, but if then there isn't a need for that level of precision and that level of investment in tools to reach that precision, then there really is not much room for that to grow and expand and fill that need, because it isn't there. So carbon has had an impact on what we do in that it is a very high precision inventory need, and these tools are being embraced more commonly and being used more widely as a result of that. So I think that's a positive outcome of carbon projects, one we're really pleased about. So next slide. So I'm going to hand it over to Jordan. Jordan, why don't you introduce yourself real quick, and we'll save our questions to the end. Jordan is going to take that next step. I've kind of gone through the past and the present. Jordan's going to pick up on the present because there's some really important technology things that are current and in use today, and he's going to look into the future and round us out. Go ahead, Jordan.
Thanks, Matt. Apologies for the late start. It wasn't because we're not excited, I'll tell you that much. So my name is Jordan. I've been working in the carbon world I used to work in the carbon world for almost about 10 years, and then I took a brief break, and now I'm back. And my focus for my PhD was using remote sensing technologies to help estimate how much carbon is stored in forests. And that's what I'm going to talk to you guys about today. Right now, as any of you who have ever done any of this work will certainly attest, there is a ton of use of remote sensing products or data collected from airplanes, drones, and satellites right now being used in the field. And what this lets us do is it lets us have a sense of what's going on a property before we get out there. And it can really help us to direct our sampling effort to target the areas that have the most variability or the most biomass. It allows us to build better stratification layers. And what you're looking at here is a Lidar canopy height layer of a forest, and it really just pops out at you where the tall trees are, where the recent harvest activity has been, where clearings are. And if you had this kind of data, you can even see individual trees. You can imagine how much more powerful that could be if you were using this to drive your sampling and reduce your sampling effort. And so this is used right now by all major landowners because it's such a powerful way to have a sense of what's in the field. But all that said, you still have to go out in the woods, and you still have to hug a bunch of trees, as Matt said, and wrap tape measures around things and look at the heights through laser beams, even if you have this Lidar canopy height model. And so the question is, can we make this even less touch? Can we get out in the field but not touch any trees? And the answer is yes. There's a lot more work to be done with this, but what you're looking at here is a handheld, what's called a ground-based Lidar system. And so this little tool is shooting out laser pulses that then hit trees and bounce back. And you can reconstruct a picture like this, which is a beautiful stem-mapped picture of your forest. And this is a picture, but because this is all just data on a computer, you can rotate this and spin it like you would see a model of a house getting spun around. And you can put this in the horizontal plane, looking down at the God's eye view, and you could see exact diameters of trees, exact tree locations. It's super powerful. And this is just by walking around. Or you could even put this on the back of an ATV and drive transects on the ATV. And so with this, you don't have to touch the trees, but you're still getting highly accurate measurements of the trees. Now, this kind of forest makes sense. You can see all these tiny trees. It's super open. I apologize if you guys can hear children crying in the background. This is my life right now. But in any case, the problem with this sort of method is that if there's a dense understory, for those of you who've ever had to beat the brush and fight your way through huckleberries in the redwood forests, this wouldn't work at all. Even if there's an understory of young trees, this isn't going to work. You're going to have a lot of occlusion. It's going to get difficult quickly. This isn't a perfect solution, but for savanna ecosystems or highly managed plantation systems, this could really be a game changer. You just drive your property on an ATV, or you walk around with this in your hand, and you get results that are really clean, beautiful, and accurate, as accurate as you would get measuring with your hands. The next thing is, obviously, you don't even want to get out there at all. You want to just fly it. And so what you're looking at on the left is a drone equipped with a similar Lidar tool that is shooting laser beams down at the forest and recording how long and the signal that is returned, and also the traditional airplane here that has a Lidar instrument implanted in its belly. And what you can do with this is you can take Lidar, but what you're looking at on the right is actually a Lidar point cloud with a true color image draped on top of it. And as you can see, you get a really clear sense of height with something like this, but now you can also start to see individual trees and individual color differences in trees, and you can start to do analysis at the tree level from the air to really understand tree health. You can get tree species, and you can start to estimate things like volume as well if you can get crown size. Now, in a closed forest canopy like what you're looking at here, that starts to get tricky. So none of these things are perfect, but with unmanned drone technology, you get really high density point clouds. You can get them out there really quick and just sort of quickly capture what's out there. That might save you a trip into the woods. You might be getting the theme here, which is we really just want you to be sitting in front of your computer. We don't want anyone going out in the woods anymore. I mean, come on. You can do that on the weekend for vacation. So that's sort of where all this is going, because going out in the woods is what costs money. It's sad. It's sad a little bit, but that is what we're trying to do here is reduce effort and know that what the data that we collect is highly accurate, but with less cost to go out and collect it. So let's see, moving on. So we could take these concepts and now we can scale them up. And so now the idea, what I've showed you before is sort of you've got access to the property, or you have a property and you want to go out there and understand what's on that property. But let's say you want to buy a property, you don't know what's on that property. Now, how could you estimate what's out there? Well, we can actually take a lot of the concepts that we've been talking about with aerial imagery and expand that in space and generate maps that look like this, where this is sort of a large area in Alabama, and what you're looking at is the different pixels here are different estimates of the species mix in a given location. And on the right side, what you're looking at is how closed the canopy is. And these estimates are driven from spaceborne satellites that are flying over your head right now, whether you like that or not. And they are collecting tons of data about the spectral reflectance in forests. And we can use this data and pair it with ground measurements to generate estimates of what's out there for the entire landscape, wall-to-wall coverage, at really, really big spatial scales. And I'm sure many of you have seen, there's layers that have been put out for the whole globe that can tell us about deforestation, reforestation, canopy cover, canopy height. There's a whole bunch of these. And this is really taking us to the next step of being able to estimate what's in the woods without actually going out there at all, and to know what's going on. So let's just recap here a little bit. Why are these new remote sensing driven estimates helpful? What do they give us? Well, first of all, less cost. The less time, it's a lot of hours in the field when you send a person out there. And if we can get similarly accurate estimates without doing that, we can save money. And when you think about scaling up to really larger and larger areas, that starts to really add up and make financial sense. Also, just because it takes so much time to mobilize a crew of people, send them into the woods, make measurements, come back, process the data, that reduces your understanding of what's going on, especially across a really long landscape. Whereas we have satellites that have a 7-day repeat cycle or a 14-day repeat cycle. So you could know every 2 weeks what's going on if you have an appropriate model. And that gives us a lot more insight into disturbances. This next bullet says more accurate estimates maybe. I think that there's still a bit of a hurdle here because we can have a sense of what's on the forest. We have a very good idea of disturbance because we can see changes in vegetation, and that is good. But then the question is, how well is this going to predict biomass? Because at the end of the day, that's what you care about, carbon. How well is this going to predict the carbon stored in the trees? And how does it compare to going outside and wrapping a tape around a tree and measuring that height of the tree in a sampling scheme that is the traditional way that things are done? I think that there are reasons for optimism that these sorts of approaches can give equivalent accuracies. And I think there's even some reason to believe that if you're able to measure every tree with remote sensing, you're getting 100% sample. It's not a sample anymore. You have a population estimate, basically. Then there are reasons to think that you could eliminate some of the sampling variability that you'd see in a traditional sample. Just like if I were to take a sample of all the women at this conference, for example, and see how tall they were. If I only took a sample of 10 women, I might have a very biased estimate of the height of women at the conference. In the same way, if I measure trees on only 10 plots and I only get 100 trees total, but there are 1,000,000 trees on my landscape, you can imagine that I might not capture the true variability or the true mean of that population of trees. Whereas if I fly this with a airplane or a drone and I can measure the height of every single tree, you can imagine how that could give me a really high accuracy estimate. And then lastly, I think we're never going to get away from being in the field, because we always are going to want to ground ourselves, pun intended, to what's happening in the woods. And so using these methods in combination with a more targeted sampling approach in the woods can help us to have confidence in the outcomes that we're predicting. And so let's bring this back to carbon. So this has been a lot of, I would say, research and science, in the sense that this stuff is all possible. But what do we need to do to apply these methods in the carbon world? How can we leverage this new technology? It's not really that new, but how can we leverage all these data sets that are out there now, and all these exciting new processing tools and processing power that we have? What's missing from the current protocols? And I would suggest that one of the biggest hurdles we have now is that all of the current protocols have been developed with really an eye towards the traditional means of estimating carbon in the field, which is a plot-based manual tree measurement approach to understanding what's out there. And I think that we as a community really need to think about, like, what can give us confidence in remote sensing driven estimates. How do we validate those things? How do we have independent third-party validation of those things? How do we correctly word these methodologies so that we can move into this future state where we're able to use a lot of this data to make our sampling more efficient and potentially more accurate? And how do we really show that statistically, that we can get those results? And so that's I think the next frontier for some of these carbon protocols, is thinking about how do you do that. And so with that, I think I'm going to wrap up for some questions. So really, right, what Matt ran us through is sort of the history of forest measurement, and it's been developed over hundreds, if not thousands, of years. People have always wanted to know what's in the woods because it had value to them, and without knowing, you're guessing. However, moving forward, we're really in this point, I would almost think of it as a tipping point, where we're trying to leverage these new technologies to really improve these estimates and reduce costs, and make it such that anyone can have a really accurate estimate of what's on their land without spending a lot of time and hiring a crew of people to go measure trees. I think that one of the foundational premises for all of this is that if you don't know what's in your forests, how big your trees are, how fast they're growing, how they're getting, how they're changing with harvest or wind throw or fire, it's really hard to appreciate their value. I think we've seen this in a lot of things, especially related to ecosystem services. If you don't know the value of the services that an ecosystem provides, it's really hard to value that, and that, as a result, leads to really bad negative externalities that are borne by the whole society. I think forests have a ton of value, and the first step in understanding that value really needs to be quantifying it. And we've seen over the years that forest owners will manage for what's most valued, and you can't really manage for things you can't measure. And so we've been able to measure volumes and carbon historically, but it's been so expensive that it's been out of reach for a lot of landowners. And so what some of these methods will allow us to do is hopefully provide measures for landowners at a smaller scale, and therefore open up access to these landowners to let them choose if they want to manage for some of these other values that are now we're able to quantify. And so I think with that, we are done. I'm going to come out of here and stop sharing my screen. and I'd love to answer any questions. Matt and I can see. Let me go over here to the Q&A. So the first, let's see here, 22 minutes ago, Guy, I'll start at the bottom. Hi, Guy, I haven't talked to you for 10 years. I hope you're doing well. Let's see here. Can these future tools see species reliably, i.e. wood density? And if so, how reliable are they? I think you're asking about remote sensing estimates of species, I believe. And I would say that doing that well is hard, depending upon where you are. And in terms of wood density, I think that, like, yes, I think the question here is sort of asking, because wood density plays such a big role in the carbon stored, where higher density tree species of the trees of the same size will have more carbon than the same size tree with a lower density, so hardwood, softwood. Yeah, knowing the tree species would be really helpful. And I think we can do it. There's been a lot of studies about this, especially using hyperspectral data, because the spectral signature of trees, the reflectance that the radiation that they reflect from incoming, like the sun, that changes depending upon their chemistry in their leaves. And so you can estimate the tree species. However, most satellites are not hyperspectral. We only have a limited number of bands that we can analyze. So I think for this, there's still some room to grow here, and it depends on how accurate you want to be. You know, if you want to just get hardwood, softwood, I think we can do a pretty good job of that, especially if there's phenological differences. But for some of these, like evergreen trees that are very similar, even like tan oak or redwood, sometimes you would be surprised. They look very similar. When you look down at a forest from a helicopter, if you're not a real expert, it's hard to see these differences. And so that's the same challenge that that remote sensing technologies will have. Here's a good question for Matt. I'm gonna read it to you, Matt. Are there specific scenarios where the laser hypsometer is used for measurements, or do you foresee this as a new standard operating procedure for landowners?
That's a great question. Thanks, Christy. And so, laser hypsometers, from our perspective, are the SOP. They are the default choice. And, there are limitations to any tool. Limitations with a laser hypsometer are condition related. The brushier, the more dense the understory, even though there's some tools to manage that with the hypsometer, the more sketchy the use of the hypsometer becomes. We also can't use a hypsometer or a laser hypsometer well when there's precipitation. You can imagine that laser intersecting with fog or snow or rain just creates problems with the precision of that measurement and the reliability of that measurement. And so we tend to default back to those analog tools in those conditions. So I feel as though, I 37 years in forestry, 27 years in forestry consulting, most of that outside of the carbon context. Even in that setting, laser hypsometers have become the standard in the eastern US. They are very common in the western US, but also alongside the reloscope, which still seems to be commonly used. I hope that answers that question for you.
An anonymous listener asked, are remote sensing tools free or paid for services? How does one access remote sensing maps? Well, I guess my first response to that would be, if you type in Google what you're looking for, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get back some things that are free. There are certainly a bunch of companies out there trying to do this right now with varying levels of maturity that you can pay. If you want to, I guess I'd make a distinction between aerial acquired remote sensing imagery and spaceborne acquired remote sensing imagery. Much of the spaceborne remote sensing data is available for free. If you want aerial imagery of a specific property, you got to pay someone to go out there and acquire it, so that's not free. And then the processing steps to get from a pixel value to something that tells you about height, or something that tells you about species, or something that tells you about canopy closure, that requires a lot of modeling and expertise. And there are maps out there that you can download that will tell you some of those things, but not all of them. And then maybe not at the resolution you need or for the specific questions. So for those sorts of things, you will probably need to pay for that or ask someone to do that for you. let's see here. The next one is a statement. What is from Guy? What is missing from current protocols is an estimate of measurement uncertainty. Currently, we're only accounting for sampling uncertainty. And I don't know, Matt, if you want to respond to that, the measurement uncertainty idea.
Well, the current protocols don't specifically address that. What they address and what they try to control is the outcome. So those of you that have been involved with developing or verification of a forest offset project know that we have this enjoyable process called sequential sampling that we go through. And this is a rigorous statistical test of the variability of our data. So it's a comparison of the cruisers, the initial developers data set as collected, which has inherent measurement risk, alongside a verifier's measurements of those same trees in same locations, which also has its own measurement variability and risk. So the outcome is as close to apples and apples as two humans can get, provided they're interpreting the rules measurement techniques in a similar fashion. And so what the current protocols manage and look for is a reasonable accounting and a reasonable control of those two risks, two different levels of human measurement risk in the per plot assessment of whether plots, the selected plots for sequential sampling, pass or fail. So you're right, it's very difficult. And I don't know exactly how we would go about writing a protocol requirement around measurement error, other than to manage its outcome at the plot level or at the per acre level or at the project level. So that's where we stand today.
I like that answer, Matt. I'm a little biased, but because I work with you, but I thought that was a wonderful answer. Let's see here. The next question is from Paulina. She asks, which are the techniques that have been applied recently to assess a third-party verification virtual site visit for a forest carbon project? That's a good question. I think right now, well, there are two kinds of verifications. There's site verifications and there are desk verifications. And so we do have a concept where we have a period of time where you can have a less intensive, and I would call it virtual verification, if you have confidence from the times when you were in the field that things are looking good, and you've done that, what Matt just described, where you have a verification body remeasure your plots and tell you things look good. Then in an interim period of years, say an interim 3 or 5 years, you can do only virtual verifications for certain protocols. There are on the horizon, there are some protocols coming out there that will allow for the same idea of intermittent field visits spread out with some desk auditing. And I think that's going to be the way it's going to go. We're never going to get away from boots on the ground because we have to be confident in these estimates because it's a commodity, just like a bushel of corn, say. And so if you can't touch that and weigh it, then you're not going to trust it. And you don't have to weigh every one, but you do have to look at it every now and then, make sure people aren't doing something that they shouldn't. And so I think, or just that we're making errors. And so we're always going to be in the field, but there is this idea of reduced effort in between the field cycles. I don't know, Matt, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. Having a remote verification is something that is currently being worked out in real time in new methodologies. And, that thought process is it's taken a lot of time. It's going to be open to peer review and public comment. And where the dust will settle on how those kinds of activities are governed and maintain their integrity in this space. The last chapter hasn't been written, but it will be written very soon, and it's exciting to see how that turns out.
Let's see. We only have 4 minutes. Let me try to speed through these. How much of this technology and data is publicly available, and what is the trend going into the future, paid or open source? There's a ton of this that's open source now. There are certainly some, as I mentioned before, a lot of paid. I think you're referring to remote sensing technologies and data. There are paid for data products. There are paid for processing platforms. There are paid for storage and paid for processing power, and there are paid for methodologies as well. All of any burgeoning industry is going to have people who want to profit from that, but there are also an equal or greater number of open source data products and tools available. So if you're interested, there's a lot out there. And then Holly just pointed folks to the University of Vermont that they have a bunch of forest LiDAR data. The USGS has a great LiDAR portal where you can see any publicly available LiDAR point cloud over the full continental US and Alaska and download it. Be prepared for terabytes of data if you're interested in that sort of thing, but it's out there. And I know that we got on this call a little bit late, so I would encourage any of you who have follow-up questions to not hesitate to reach out to Matt or I. We're pretty friendly folk, and we would love to answer additional questions. And then I'll read this last comment from Guy. Guy is pointing out that the examples we gave only account for sampling uncertainty. They assume the verifier measurement is truth. Look at SCP. And I'm going to let Matt handle that one because he handled the first one.
Yeah, Guy, you and I have had discussions in the field about this same thing, and you're completely correct. The verification procedures as they stand assume that the verifiers recorded measurements are correct, and that's why we do them together. The goal of that verification site visit is to get the right answer, not get a different answer, not get an erroneous answer, to get the right answer and to take the time we need to take to get it right. That means checking and making sure that we've accounted for measurements that maybe were unforeseen and counter to what we expected. So yeah, right or wrong, that's the way the verification procedures to date have been written, and that thought process around trying to capture measurement error and provide latitude, maybe that's not the right word, but account for the difference in human error from a verifier to a cruiser. And that would take some real thought and creativity to try to improve upon. But I really appreciate where you're coming from on it.
So one last question and a comment. Christy Pillay-Young expresses that verifiers are never wrong, and as a employer of verifiers, I have to agree with her. Come on. We have an ulterior motive, but yes. Hi, Christy. I think the next question is an interesting one. Are there measurement accuracy concerns when your forest tract has areas of evergreens and areas of hardwoods? And I would say that there are similar concerns no matter what species you have out there. And just to run through like a couple that are on my mind is the volume equations that estimate how much volume is in wood in the tree given its diameter and height. They have error, and they have different errors depending upon the species, and evergreens have a more consistent form than hardwoods. And so you may expect to see a little more error in your hardwood volume estimation. However, at a property scale or at a larger scale, those errors do kind of get washed out. So I would, the mean stays true, but the variability might be a little higher the higher your with hardwoods. But from my experience, and maybe Matt has a different experience, we've been measuring hardwoods, we've been measuring evergreens, softwoods for hundreds of years. We have a pretty good sense of how these trees, what their volumes and carbon, what their volumes are given these measurements. And so I don't think there's a significant difference in measurement accuracy for those when you have a mixed forest versus a homogeneous forest.
Yeah, I think that when you have a mixed forest, you have an inherently more complicated setting. Deciduous forests are problematic in that you really need a leaf-on condition to be able to reliably predict the species mix that we're dealing with. In my woodlot here at home on my farm, I've got 27 commercial species of hardwood, and to try to do that remotely is very difficult. But in those instances, with this new technology, if we layer some ground truthing and ground plots to train our model, that can improve that outcome. We can also layer additional data sets like color infrared or other remotely sensed data that is leaf on that would help us better determine between species. And truth be told, there may be some value to simplifying things into species groups that remote sensing can do very well, and try to fill our buckets that way. So there's a lot of tools in the toolbox here. No one solution is the end all be all answer, and we have to fit this technology and the right solution to the right project in the right forest.
Well, I think we're over time, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. Please reach out with other questions or thoughts, and enjoy the rest of your conference. Sorry again for the delay. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.